Welcome back to The Will to Wisdom. Today, we delve into one of the most uncomfortable, yet arguably most illuminating corners of Arthur Schopenhauer's philosophy, his notorious views on women. Arthur Schopenhauer, often dubbed the philosopher of pessimism, was the mind behind the world as will and representation. He was a thinker, profoundly influenced by Eastern philosophy and fiercely critical of his contemporaries, such as Hegel. Although largely overlooked during his early career, Schopenhauer gained significant recognition later in life, particularly with the publication of Parerga and Paralipomena, a collection of essays and observations that were, in many ways, more popular and accessible than his main work. It is within Parerga and Paralipomena that we find the essay we're focusing on today, one explicitly titled On Women. Now, fair warning, the sources available to us describe this essay in no uncertain terms. It has been called notoriously offensive. It contains highly derogatory language, and one source even refers to it simply as ugly writing. Our goal here is not to endorse these views, but to understand what they were, why Schopenhauer, based on his broader philosophy, might have held them, and what we can learn even from uncomfortable truths or, in this case, potentially deeply flawed perspectives. We will explore this challenging topic, drawing solely on the information provided in our source materials. So, let's step into this controversial space, guided by Schopenhauer's own words and the commentary from the sources that discuss this specific essay. The philosopher's stance. Where do Schopenhauer's views on women, as presented in this essay and discussed in the sources, begin? They begin with a stark, hierarchical framing of the sexes. Our sources tell us that in the essay On Women, Schopenhauer affirms the intellectual, moral, physical, and aesthetic superiority of men over women. This is the foundational claim, the basis upon which many of his other specific assertions about women seem to rest. Men. Superiority claimed. He asserts that women exist solely for the propagation of the species. This isn't just one purpose among others, but their sole purpose. From this perspective, their natural role is narrowly defined. They are naturally suited to be nurses and governesses, and to comforting and pleasing men. Nature, in his view, specifically destined the young, strong men and women for propagation. Sole purpose, propagation. This biological imperative, according to Schopenhauer, dictates a form of secret, unconscious, but innate morality in women. This hidden morality allows them to deceive those who, by focusing on the individual woman, might obstruct the interests of the species. They are, in essence, prioritizing the overarching goal of species survival and perpetuation over individual agreements or personal interests. This perspective is deeply embedded in his broader philosophical system, particularly in his concept of the will to life. Connecting to the will to life. To understand why Schopenhauer might view women's nature as so singularly focused on propagation, we need to examine the engine of his metaphysics, the will. For Schopenhauer, the world as we experience it, the world of objects in space and time, the world of cause and effect, is representation. But behind this perceived world is the will, a blind, irrational, striving force, the thing in itself. The will manifests itself at different levels throughout nature, from physical forces to human actions. In living beings, this fundamental urge is most clearly seen as the will to life. This isn't merely the desire to survive as individuals, but the relentless drive to exist and perpetuate existence across time. The sources explain that love and sexual instinct, in Schopenhauer's view, are nature's trick or illusion. This illusion motivates individuals who are otherwise fundamentally egoistic to pursue goals that transcend their own happiness. Primarily, the propagation of the species. For the will, the species' interest is paramount, infinitely more important than the interests of individual beings. Love is nature's illusion. Women, within this framework, are seen as the primary biological agents of this species-driven will. Their very nature, as Schopenhauer perceives it, is tied to this fundamental, unconscious drive toward reproduction. Even their actions, including the secret morality that permits deception, can be interpreted as serving the will's most basic command. Continue the line, ensure existence goes on. Critique of the Dhamma and European women. Schopenhauer's views weren't limited to women's biological function. He also had specific critiques of their social position in his time, particularly the modern European conception of women. He found the status of the European Dama, lady, to be a false position. He argued that women are not absolutely suited to be the object of our reverence and veneration, to hold their heads higher than men, or to have the same rights. He believed that if women in Europe were returned to a position conforming to their nature, society would see incalculably beneficial consequences. He even suggested that cultures such as those of Asia, Greece, and Rome would have laughed at the European Dhamma. Instead of Dama, he thought society should foster housewives and girls who hope to become so. Contrast imagery, historical depictions of European women versus classical Eastern depictions or symbolic imagery of social roles. Beyond their perceived social overreach, he criticized European women for their alleged material vanity, an obsession with beauty, luxury, and display. This, combined with what he described as their scarce reasoning, made them prone to wastefulness, a point he emphasized by quoting the ancient poet Menander, "The woman is wasteful by nature." Wasteful by nature. His views on women's intellectual capacities were particularly harsh. He claimed that women generally do not love any art, nor recognize themselves in any, and have no genius. Their natural brain composition, he asserted, is not capable of much. He even linked a woman's insensitivity to noise, a personal pet peeve of his, discussed in another essay, to having a coarse nature. No genius? Scarce reasoning? It's important to note the rhetorical framing in his writing as well. Our sources point out that Schopenhauer often assumes his reader is male, using we and us when discussing observations about women, implying a shared male perspective distinct from the female one. Stories, examples, and biographical echoes. Schopenhauer's views, as starkly presented in his essays, don't exist in a vacuum. His sources and biography offer important context and perhaps even some contradictions or ironies when we examine the examples provided. A significant biographical point is his deeply strained relationship with his mother, Johanna. She was a successful author, a cultivated woman, but was described by Anselm Feuerbach, the father of philosopher Ludwig Feuerbach, as without heart and soul, self-complacent, eager after approbation, and someone who prattled much and well, intelligently. Feuerbach notably added, "God preserve us from women whose mind has shot up into mere intellect." This description echoes some of Schopenhauer's later criticisms of certain types of female intellect or disposition. One source even suggests that his essay on women may have been influenced by this turbulent relationship. Their temperaments were opposing, leading to a final break in which they didn't see each other for 24 years, although correspondence resumed later. Strained relationship with Mother Johanna. Schopenhauer's views on marriage were similarly dismissive. He called it a debt contracted in youth and paid off in old age. He saw married people as bearing the whole burden of life, while the unmarried bore only half a characteristically selfish apothegm. He noted that all the true philosophers, including Descartes, Leibniz, Spinoza, and Kant, were celibates. Yet despite this stance, sources mention that the idea of marriage seems to have more or less possessed Schopenhauer at one point, but he could not finally determine to take the step. He even nearly married a noblewoman in Italy, but was prevented by an insurmountable obstacle, which his translator speculates may have been her illness. Marriage, a debt. Irony appears in his personal life. Despite his harsh public pronouncements on women, one source quotes Ernst Otto Lindner, who met Schopenhauer late in life, as saying the philosopher admitted openly that in his life, sexual love and women had given him very much to do. This suggests a complex, perhaps contradictory, personal experience. He had significant relationships, including an adventure in Venice with Teresa Fuga, a long-term relationship with Caroline Richter in Berlin, and an attachment to the sculptor Elisabeth Ney later in life. The story of his relationship with Teresa Fuga, based on a letter she wrote, is particularly revealing. Her letter contains numerous grammatical errors and even misspells his name as Sharonhans. One source notes that Schopenhauer, meticulous about language, was typically infuriated by such errors. Yet, blinded by passion, accecato dalla passione, he overlooked both the mistakes and her infidelity, rushing back to Venice to see her. If accurate, this anecdote offers a real-life example of his own theory, that sexual instinct eros, the will to life, can override reason and individual concern. Blindness of passion. He uses animal examples to illustrate this point in other writings. The trout easily caught when in Fregola, heat, the ibex ignoring danger, the donkey following a female off a precipice. These, he argues, show that sexual instinct can even overpower the will to self-preservation, reinforcing his view that instinct, tied to the species' continuation, is a fundamental, overriding force. Finally, adding yet another layer of complexity. One source mentions that shortly before his death, when reproached for his views on women, Schopenhauer replied that he had not yet said the last word on the subject. This may suggest a potential softening, a recognition of complexity he had perhaps oversimplified, or simply a characteristically enigmatic remark. Criticisms and counterpoints from the sources. As we've seen, the sources themselves don't shy away from calling out the negative aspects of these views. They label them offensive, ugly, and derogatory. The description of his arguments as tirades suggests a tone that is more ranting than reasoned philosophical discourse, a characteristic noted in other popular essays in Parerga and Paralipomena. Ugly writing tirades. One source notes that the essay is more descriptive than speculative, suggesting it might be more a reflection of personal bias or societal observation than a rigorous philosophical deduction, although it remains connected to his broader system. There's also a potential tension within his own ideas. While he broadly dismisses women's intellect, he also states, in his Metaphysics of Sexual Love, that intelligence is inherited from the mother. He even describes this maternal intelligence as the instrument of knowledge and therefore of redemption, the very path to potentially transcending the blind will to life that he proposes. This seems to grant mothers a crucial role in the possibility of escaping the suffering inherent in existence, a role tied directly to intelligence. How this aligns with his claims of women's limited intellectual capacity is not fully reconciled in the provided texts, presenting a possible area of internal conflict within his thought. Intelligence from mother? Contradiction? Furthermore, while his On Women essay portrays a narrow, essentialist view, other aspects of his philosophy, as noted by one source, show sensitivity to the suffering of non-human animals and the victims of the slave trade. This suggests that his harshness was not uniformly applied to all groups outside the dominant social norm, but had specific targets. The portrayal of the European Dama as a ridiculous monster also appears to be a critique laced with social resentment tied to the specific social structures and perceived artificiality of European high society, rather than a purely metaphysical argument. His preference for housewives over Dhamma hints at a kind of social conservatism that coexisted with his more radical metaphysical ideas. Why engage with this today? Lessons learned. So, why spend time exploring views that are undeniably offensive to modern sensibilities? As difficult as it is, engaging with controversial historical thought, rooted in specific cultural and personal contexts, can offer valuable, albeit uncomfortable, insights. Imagery suggesting critical analysis or historical context. Lesson 1. Understanding the roots of bias. Schopenhauer's views, tied to his metaphysical system that prioritizes the species over the individual and sees existence as suffering driven by a blind will, offer a philosophical framework for deep-seated misogyny. While we reject the conclusions, understanding the attempt to ground such views in a comprehensive worldview helps us recognize that bias is rarely baseless. It's often built upon underlying assumptions about nature, purpose, and value. His link between perceived biological role and inherent characteristics serves as a stark example of biological essentialism. Understanding bias. The philosopher as human. Schopenhauer's personal struggles, particularly his difficult relationship with his mother and his complex experiences with women, may have undeniably colored his philosophical pronouncements. This reminds us that even the most abstract philosophical systems can be, at least in part, products of personal biography and emotional experience. It cautions us against accepting philosophical claims solely on their systematic merit without considering the human element behind them.